Back in the late 19th and early 20th century, the United States would do a series of interventions and occupations of several countries in Central America and the Caribbean. There, the locals would not take kindly to U.S. occupation and therefore fought the Americans. This will be known as the Banana Wars, a series of conflicts in Latin America and the Caribbean that would show that the U.S. has always been a kind of nation to spread its influence around the world, militarily speaking, but also economic. In Latin America, many workers in these countries were tired of working in long hours and poor conditions. Because of this, many workers went on strikes, while others made militias and started a revolution in these countries. However, American businesses in these countries had interest in them. Because of this, companies such as the United Fruit Company went to the American government to ask for their support in order to stop these uprisings. The U.S. government agreed and sent the U.S. Marines to the following countries of Panama, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, Honduras, and even Mexico. These companies will hire mercenary groups to keep the populace in line. This is where the term Banana Republic would come from. No, not the store. Basically a country that's controlled by foreign businesses. The Central American country of Nicaragua will go through a similar process, with the U.S. occupying the nation and Nicaraguan rebels fighting against the U.S. Marines.
Since the 1800s, the United States had been calling the shots, invading Nicaragua no less than 8 times, overthrowing and installing successive governments. And their interests extended to their control of land and agricultural production, meaning that the rural poor were essentially tenants on their own land. But this overwhelming U.S. influence helped create a Nicaraguan rebel legend. Augusto Cesar Sandino would lead the first armed nationalist movement in Latin America to drive American military forces from the region. Sandino's name would later be taken by the Sandinistas, who claimed to be representing his principles.
In the 1930s, U.S. Marines had put the tyrant Tacho Somoza in power. More than 40 years later, Nicaragua was still ruled by a Somoza. A politically moderate newspaper owner, Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, dared to challenge the dictatorship.
So what happened to this person who wanted freedom? Well, they murdered him. Who murdered him? The Somoza forces.
Chamorro's murder electrified the cowed people of Nicaragua. Somoza declared a state of siege. The U.S. woke up to popular anger against the super-rich family which had been its ally for more than 4 decades.
I have been fighting the East-West ideological war since the inception of Fidel Castro. So we've been under the attack of that Cuban government for almost 18 years.
From the hills, where they had been secretly training for years, guerrillas emerged who proudly bore the name of the 1930s anti-Yankee rebel, Sandino. But in the town of Esteli, Somoza's World War II U.S. tanks carried the day. "2,000 people died in what became a dead city." The Sandinistas regrouped, pitting their rifles against Somoza's might.
The front now entered the cities and knocked on the door of the capital for the first time in its history.
The Sandinistas' will to win triumphed. Managua went mad with joy. Jimmy Carter had left it very late before abandoning the Somozas and accepting the new Sandinista government.
I said to Carter, the United States had to make good the historical damage they had inflicted on our country. Our party hymn still includes the words, Yankee, the enemy of humanity. We said to him that the only way to abolish that line would be for the attitude of the imperialist powers to change throughout the world.
With the political revolution complete, the Sandinistas wasted no time in embarking upon a social revolution. They launched a widely applauded campaign that reduced illiteracy from 60% to just 13%. Education and healthcare were made available to those who'd never had them, and an ambitious land redistribution program was launched. For the first time, those who had toiled on the land their whole lives had a chance to own it.
In Nicaragua, Somoza's land was shared out and the family's business monopolies were taken over. Education and healthcare became widely available.
Alfabetizar, sí, 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 todo el pueblo. Alfabetizar, sí, 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 estudiantes. Alfabetizar, sí, 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 feministas. Alfabetizar.
In this push for mass literacy, the arts became an integral part of the widespread movement for social change. Muralists, both nationally and internationally, were hired to illustrate the goals and ideals of post-revolutionary Nicaragua. International muralist brigades like the Felicia Santizo Brigade of Panama were the first to depict important historical moments of the Sandinista revolution, provide a narrative of the revolution, and promote a vision of a post-revolutionary future. They used public spaces to depict important military victories and battles won during the Sandinista insurrection. The mural campaign was for many artists an opportunity to show the injustices that were inflicted on Nicaraguans by the US-installed Somoza regime. They also show how muralism in Nicaragua continued the Latin American muralist tradition of rejecting capitalism and its neo-colonialist ideals in favor of a socialism that was more akin to the indigenous social structures of the past. The murals aimed at changing the colonialist ideals that structure postmodern society in order to focus on the creation of a more cohesive social structure that benefited indigenous people. Consumer culture and neoconservatism were seen as a new type of colonialism, a neo-colonialism that threatened to destroy the fabric of life in Nicaragua. Artists understood that in order to depict an indigenous Latin American point of view, the murals needed a visual language that would be accessible to the public. The murals created in Nicaragua continued the mixture of European and indigenous artistic styles and traditions that the great Mexican muralists explored in the 30s and 50s. They attest to the influence that Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Orozco had on Latin American muralism. The murals send a message to imperial powers that this revolution unified the people of Nicaragua against the neo-colonialist framework behind postmodernist culture and gives testimony to the confrontation between capitalism and socialism in the 1980s. As an expression of activist art, the murals depict the cultural resistance against neo-colonialism and represents a counter-history that turns towards the social and political in art to shape society. Like Lippert's Trojan horse, the murals enter public spaces to display a socialist reality that would have never been possible before the revolution. It engages in social issues and social change through a great variety of pictorial narratives that represent the ideology that pushed the people of Nicaragua to revolt against neo-colonialist society in favor of a promised post-colonial reality.
It was an unprecedented revolutionary experiment in the region. The Sandinistas promised political pluralism, a mixed economy, and non-alignment. But within months, these high ideals would be put to the test, as old tensions with the U.S. re-emerged. But in Washington, the victory of the young pro-Cuban Sandinistas was seen as a threat, one the United States would go to extraordinary lengths to crush.
To do nothing in Central America is to give the first communist stronghold on the North American continent a green light to spread its poison throughout this free and increasingly democratic country.
And so, once again, the United States intervened in Nicaragua. In late 1981, the CIA launched both overt and covert operations to finance a counter-revolutionary army with remnants of Somoza's National Guard, better known as the Contras. Less than 2 years after Somoza's overthrow, Nicaragua's period of peace was over. With their ragtag army and outdated weaponry, the Sandinistas were ill-equipped to confront the U.S.-financed counter-revolutionaries. They turned to the obvious place for help, to Washington's biggest adversary, the Soviet Union.
For nearly a decade, the Reagan administration poured military aid to the Contra-insurgents to try and bring down Mr. Ortega and his Sandinistas. That backfired when the White House ignored Congress's ban on military aid. It was the Reagan administration that was almost brought down. The sight of Mr. Ortega and his friend Fidel Castro apparently thumbing their noses at Washington drove Mr. Reagan to distraction. That led to the Iran-Contra scandal, the sale of arms to Iran to provide funds for the Contras. It toppled several Reagan aides. Oliver North was convicted of criminal offenses. Mr. Reagan's national security advisor, Admiral John Poindexter, is still facing charges, and the repercussions continue to reverberate. Only last week, ex-President Reagan gave videotaped evidence, once again denying he played a direct role in the affair. The scandal put an end to military aid to the Contras, but Mr. Bush tightened his economic blockade and gave £5 million towards Mrs. Chamorro's election campaign. Today it paid off, and now Mr. Bush is rushing to put together an aid package to help Mrs. Chamorro get Nicaragua out of the economic mess brought about largely by US sanctions.